Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. So you probably noticed right off the bat, I'm not in my customary purple shirt. Something happened to that. I don't know where it is. I couldn't find it. It was a very stressful event this morning trying to look for it. But nonetheless, so you'll just have to deal with me wearing this blue shirt today. So anyway, today we have Dr. David Allen Black with us, and he's going to talk to us about the Sturzian view of textual criticism. And I'm really excited to have him on. So, Dr. Black, why don't you go ahead and say hello to everybody?
Hey everybody, how y'all doing today?
Now, the Sturzian view is relatively new to me, and I think it's relatively new to a number of people. So, can you give us like a brief breakdown of what the Sturzian view of textual criticism is?
Yeah, and here's the book in case anybody's interested in it. Just was recently reprinted. This was his doctoral dissertation at Grace Theological Seminary, the Byzantine text type and New Testament textual criticism. So basically, he wrote that book in order to ask this question: can the Wescotte and Hort view be falsified? And he answered that question with a resounding yes. And I happen to agree with that perspective. You know, he argued that you cannot say that Lucian of Antioch in the year 311, created the Byzantine text by combining the Western and Alexandrian texts on the basis of 8 examples of conflation, for example,
Right.
Or the Byzantine text is late because of the silence of the fathers, because after all, that's an argument from silence.
Silence. Yeah.
So he argued that the Byzantine text represents an early and independent stream of witness, just like the Western and the Alexandrian texts do, and all of them push back to the 2nd century. Incidentally, we probably should say something about the term text type, because as you know, that's being disputed these
Yeah.
days. I'm perfectly happy to use that term. I think it should be used. I think it will continue to be used. I noticed in this book on Can We Recover that came out of the Clearview conference that Peter Gurry continues to use those terms. Maurice Robinson will have nothing to do with it. I mean, he calls it the
Yeah.
Alexandrian type of text or the Alexandrian type of cluster, but
Yeah.
he won't call it a text type, even though that's what he basically means. So you can call it whatever you want. Clusters, you can call it families, the term I like, Dwayne, is streams.
Yeah, that works.
We have this big, huge river up here called the Byzantine. Then we have this rivulet down here called the Egyptian or the Alexandrian. Then we have this thing over here that's
Mhm.
just flooding everything called the Western. As you know, the Western text goes in all
Yeah.
different directions. And in fact, in the
Right.
book of
Right.
Acts, it's 8% longer than the Alexandrian. So
It's interesting, like when you consider text types, I think the reason why Dr. Robinson is so against the idea of calling them text types is because it gives the impression that each text type is the result of recensional activity. And of course, he doesn't subscribe to that, from what I understand.
no, I heard in your interview with him, by the way, he said text type is okay as long as you don't define it as recensional activity.
That's right.
So I'm very happy with that term. But again, the term that I prefer is stream, but it doesn't really matter. It all means
Mhm.
the same thing. We have 3 kinds of witnesses, 3 local texts that arose by the 2nd century. So Harry Sturtz now feels that there are these 3 streams, these 3 rivers. One is the Alexandrian, one is the Byzantine, and one is the Western, and they all push back to the 2nd century, equally independently to the 2nd century. He did not believe that they all went back into the 1st century necessarily.
Right.
So he's not arguing that he could recover the original text of the New Testament. In fact, I would say this: it would be unthinkable for Harry Sturtz to have talked about producing a Greek New Testament, which he was in the process of doing, and use the words original text or original Greek in his title, because he didn't think that was attainable. So his goal was to produce the text that was found in the 2nd century. In fact, the title of his Greek New Testament was the Greek New Testament according to the 2nd century. And he was able to finish his fascicle of Matthew. Unfortunately, couldn't get any farther than that. And I really regretful about that. So you have these 3 streams, these three traditions that go all the way back there. Now, someone will say, well, wait a minute. In the Gospels, the earliest physical document we can get our hands on for the Byzantine text is Alexandrinus from the 5th century. So how can the Byzantine text be any earlier than that? And the answer to that is pretty obvious. We must always distinguish between the date of a manuscript and the date of its
Reading.
The classic example of this is the work of Wescotte and Hort themselves,
Mhm.
because as you know, they did their work prior to the discovery of the papyri. There were no 2nd century Alexandrian papyri. There were no 3rd century. They had 2 4th century manuscripts, 350 and 375-ish. But they argued that because Sinaiticus and Vaticanus neither were copied from each other, that the reading that they preserve must predate those physical documents in which they are found, and therefore their reading pushes into the 2nd century, if not into the 1st century. Here we have three text types, 3 families, 3 streams of testimony, and basically the Harry Sturtz position is the original reading is probably the one that is the most ubiquitous. So if I were to summarize his view in one word, it would be ubiquity.
Okay.
In
Okay.
two words, it would be maybe geographical provenance. Or to really reduce it to its most basic, the more ubiquitous a reading is, the more likely it is to be original. And the more localized a reading is, the less likely it is to be
Right.
original. So he took a consensus. Now, he never named his view, so I haven't named his view for him, but he took a consensus of the text type. So it's not just equitable eclecticism, not we have three equal text types.
Mhm.
It's that you take the consensus of 2 out of 3, and that is more likely to be the original reading than not. And
Right.
that's what I applied in my publications that I've done in the different articles in these different journals that I use. 3 of them as examples in my
Okay.
essay in the book, as you know, Ephesians 1:1, Matthew 5:22, and John 3:13.
Yeah,
So I
and
hope that
we'll talk
hope that
about
makes
that. Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So is there ever a
Yeah.
scenario, or have you ever come across a case where you believe that the original reading was actually not the consensus? So it wouldn't have been the best 2 out of 3, so to speak. Have
Well,
you ever come across
absolutely. I
that?
mean, I blogged about this the other day. 1 Timothy 3:16 is the classic example, right?
Okay.
Because you have the Alexandrian ha, who
Yeah.
was manifested. You have the Western, I'm sorry, has in the Alexandrian, the
Yeah.
masculine pronoun. And then you have the neuter pronoun ha, which was manifested, of course,
Yeah.
in the Western text. And then, of course, we all know that the Byzantine text has the as. So but that is so rare. It is so rare.
Oh,
I
right.
hardly
Right.
ever see that kind of a thing. So there, you're more forced to use the internal evidence at that point. But
Okay.
that is so rare that I mean, that's probably the only example that I can really think of.
Okay, now I could go back and read the article, and I probably will, but just for the sake of us being on this conversation,
Mhm.
what did you come down on for First Timothy 3:16?
I'd never published an article on that. I'm just using that as an
Gotcha.
illustration.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
there again, I would be more forced to go to the internal evidence that I'm comfortable doing. And we can talk
Okay.
about this later if you want, Dwayne, but to me, the internal evidence is too subjective to be probative.
Yeah, and that's the argument that I've always talked about, the internal versus external evidences. The internal evidence can be abused and manipulated,
Mhm.
and generally it's a rubber ruler when we talk about it. Yeah, not to say that it doesn't have a case for usage, but you can't really rely on it entirely.
Well, here's a classic
So
example is this last 12 verses
sure.
of Mark. Okay.
Yeah.
So you look at the external evidence. What does it prove? There's 1,000, what is it, 1,653 manuscripts that contain
Hmm.
it. And how
Yep.
many do not?
Right. Like
Dos
three.
equis.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
two manuscripts.
Two and a half. Right.
We'll call it two,
Yeah,
2.5.
three. Was it three? Is it
But here's the
314?
deal.
But yeah.
You've talked about this, and I loved your discussion. But the ESV, what
Yeah.
does the ESV note say? Some early manuscripts do not include 6:9 through 20. What?
Mm.
Some?
So some.
Some? And here, then people will say, no, well, we got to talk about the internal evidence. Nope, don't go there. Case closed. The
Yeah.
external evidence decides the case right there. The reading is original. It's authoritative. It's the Ausgangstext. It is authorial.
Hmm.
Now, if you want to go to the internal evidence at that point, which I have done, and you want to discuss, well, how then do you account for the stylistic differences between the last 12 verses of Mark and other passages? I have my opinion on that. And if you're interested, you can read it in my book, Why Four Gospels? The Historical Origins of the Gospels. My opinion is that Mark himself may have been responsible. Remember, Mark never set out to write a gospel. He simply was the hermeneutes, the interpreter of Peter in Rome, as Peter gave a series of 5 didascalias before the equites in Rome. And
Right.
he served as the stenographer. He simply recorded what Peter was lecturing on in midair, viva voce, and then reduced that to writing.
Right.
Now, but here's the deal. When it left his hands, Mark's hands, we're talking about the Ausgangs, the exit text,
Yeah.
the authorial text, the original text, the authoritative text. That included
Mhm.
the last 12 verses of Mark. Period. Case closed. So why are we even talking about the internal evidence? And I'll tell you why. I mean, my suspicion is, Dwayne, because those two manuscripts happen to be Aleph and B.
I think so. I think you're right. Because as far as I understand it, there wasn't any real serious consideration of the last few verses of Mark there until the discovery of was it Vaticanus? Vaticanus was discovered first by Tischendorf. And I think that's what really ramped up the discussion. It's kind of reminds me a little bit about the 666 versus the 616 variant. So everyone's happy with 666 and everything's good, and generally speaking, I mean, the evidence is all for it. We would probably agree on that externally. The evidence for 666 is so much better. But nobody really mentioned or talked about 616 until Dan Wallace made that discovery on I think it was it Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus? I can't remember which one
I
it was.
don't remember.
And
Yeah.
he saw it there. And so he publicized it and not published it, but like made it popular. And of course, a bunch of people kind of jumped on that because Dan Wallace, well, he speaks popularly on the subject. So
Mhm.
now 666 and 616. It's not a huge thing, but it
Well,
comes up.
Dan Wallace, in his interview with Peter Gurry, claimed to be a Sturzian for over a decade. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
Dan and I went to Biola together. We were there together. We took Harry Sturtz for textual criticism, but he himself says he was a Sturzian for over a decade. And what made him change his mind was the internal evidence.
Right.
And you see, it's the internal evidence that these
Right.
people are going to be leaning harder and harder on and moving away from what I would consider to be the probative evidence, which is the external. So in my humble opinion, the internal evidence is never probative. It's what I call corroborative. So in the three examples, if you want to discuss those three examples today, you're going to see that on the basis of the external evidence, I've arrived at my conclusion. But then the next important question is when you go to the internal evidence, what is the most important question of internal evidence? Prefer that reading that what? Best explains the origins of the others.
Right.
Or that at least explains the origins of the others. I think you do have to go there. But the problem is you can go often in either direction on the basis of the internal evidence. It doesn't necessarily prove anything. And if I could add something, I've extended that principle to two other areas of investigation: the synoptic problem and the authorship of Hebrews. So synoptic problem, I was taught Markan priority hypothesis, Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke, M&L, all of that. And I taught it for many years. And then I had the audacity, naivete, or stupidity to actually go to London, West London, Ealing Abbey, which has perhaps the best patristics library in the world. And I myself, from the Greek and the Latin, came up with a fresh translation of everything the fathers said about the origins of the Gospels. And guess what they taught? The earliest fathers were unanimous that our earliest Gospel was not Mark's, it was Matthew.
Oh, interesting.
And then when you think about it, where was the earliest felt need for a Gospel? It wasn't in Rome in the 60s.
No.
It was in Palestine in the 30s and 40s. So I call Matthew the Gospel of Acts 1 through 12, the ministry of Peter. And then as soon as the gospel began to penetrate beyond Palestine, there was a need for a new kind of a gospel that was nuanced more to the Hellenistic mind. And now Paul himself wasn't responsible for it, but he had a really educated guy with him who could investigate that and write this Hellenistic gospel. I call that the Gospel of Acts 13 through 29. And then later on, Mark comes along, and the question is, well, why did we need a Mark if we have a Matthew and a Luke? And why did he write it? And the answer to that question is he never set out to write it. He never set out to write the gospel. He simply recorded Peter's lectures there in Rome. So the internal evidence can go, and if you just limit it to the internal evidence, people argue for Lucan priority. They argue for whatever priority. And you could go anywhere on that. Here's the other issue. Okay, so I was taught that if there's one thing we know about Hebrews for certain, that Paul could never have been the author. And I taught that for many, many years.
Sure.
And then I began to compare Hebrews with the 13 authentic Paulines. And there are 13, not just 7 or 8. In my opinion, there are 13 of them. And guess what I discovered on the basis of the internal evidence? That there are many linguistic, theological, conceptual affinities. Scores of them. And I've actually published a book called The Authorship of Hebrew, The Case for Paul. And what I did was I looked at the internal evidence and compared, but that didn't prove anything. Just because only Hebrews and First Thessalonians uses that rare particle toigarun, or just because only Paul in Hebrews quotes Habakkuk 2:4, Romans, Galatians, and that doesn't prove anything. But here's what does prove it. When you look at the external evidence, the tradition of the early church of the first 4 centuries, in the Eastern church, there was a continuous, unanimous consent to Pauline authorship. That's Origen, that's his predecessor Clement, that was his predecessor Pantaenus, and Pantaenus referred to the archaioi Andres, the ancient man, as holding the Paulinity of the letter. Now, there was some uncertainty as who was the penman, who wrote it down. And Origen said it could have been Luke, it could have been Clement, but he always quoted it as Paul's. In fact, I have an appendix in my book, Origen on the authorship of Hebrews, because when Origen said who wrote the epistle, God only knows, he was not uncertain about who the author was, but only the penman. Because
I see.
And I cite this over and over again. Origen consistently cites Hebrews as Paul. He says, just as Paul says, quote, then he quotes Hebrews. Just as the great apostle Paul says, and then he quotes Hebrews. Now, in the Western church, it took a lot longer, but by the 4th century, how many epistles of Paul do we have in the canons in the West? We have 14 of them.
Right.
And incidentally, here's something that people need to know, that Hebrews always circulated as Paul as a part of the Pauline corpus, always. Never part of the general epistles. So that's how it got into the Bible. The tenet of apostolicity. Do you know about the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, right? I'm sure you got a copy. Here's one of the things I love about it. It places the general epistles before the Pauline epistles because you know what they're doing? They're following the uncials or the majuscules of the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries.
Right.
I love that order. But here's what they did. You know what they did with Hebrews?
They separated
placed it after Philemon.
Yeah.
Now, here's the deal. You look at these 4th, 5th, and 6th century uncial manuscripts. Guess where Hebrews comes? After 2nd Thessalonians.
Mm.
Where does it come in the Wescotte and Hort text? After 2nd Thessalonians. Where does it come in the Robinson-Pierpont text? After 2nd Thessalonians. Where does it come in Trigalis? Remember, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament is an updating of Trigalis. Yep. So where does it come in Trigalis? After 2nd Thessalonians. But how convenient not to follow that, because now we put it after Philemon, which makes it much easier for us to attach it to the general epistles rather than to the Pauline epistles. On the basis of the external evidence, I've argued for the Pauline authorship of Hebrews. I've argued for Matthain priority. And in these 3 examples that I think you want to discuss with me today, also argued for the authenticity of readings that are found in the footnote in the apparatus of my Greek New Testament.
All right. So before we get into those 3 examples, how does Sturzian methodologies differ from current modern critical practices?
It has a lot in common with all 3 of them. Thoroughgoing eclecticism, reason eclecticism, and Byzantine priority. With thoroughgoing or radical eclecticism, it says we can't slavishly follow any manuscript or text type. None is to be automatically preferred. However, with the thoroughgoing eclectic, they will place all of their eggs in one basket. That's the internal evidence. The external evidence, the manuscripts, the versions, and fathers basically function as repositories of readings.
Right.
And once we know what the readings are, right, NFSO or no NFSO or AK or no AK, etc., then the internal evidence becomes probative. Right. Well, the Sturtz position doesn't say that at all. The Sturtz position is you've got to start with that external evidence, and then the internal evidence will come and corroborate that. In terms of reason eclecticism, we take both the external and the internal evidence into account, just as they do. And they will say quite clearly that they do not slavishly follow Aleph and B. They do not slavishly follow the Alexandrian text. And I believe them. I believe they are very open to the Byzantine text. But what happens is oftentimes it's the internal evidence that becomes probative for them. And in Sturtzian, that's never the case. And then finally, with Byzantine priority, and we need to be very careful about this, because please do not lump Harry Sturz in as a Byzantine.
No.
He was. I know you wouldn't, but he definitely wasn't. But he had a very high view of the Byzantine text.
Right.
In fact, did you know that Harry Sturz was on the translation committee of the New King James Version?
Yes.
He's not a TR proponent. He's not a Byzantine proponent. But what he found and what I have found is this, Dwayne. Of the 3 text types, the one that least often stands alone is the Byzantine text.
That's right.
Which attests its general good quality. So these are some ways that you have some similarities and some differences. But the most important difference of all, I think, is the fact that we want to. Let's go back to the theology of divine sovereign preservation.
Yes.
I was watching a YouTube the other day where it was defined as follows: divine sovereign preservation refers to the fact that God has sovereignly preserved to us the New Testament. I'm good with that so far.
Yep.
Through the majority of extant Greek documents.
Oh no.
Now I'm good with that too, Dwayne.
Yeah. Okay.
Are all the Byzantine manuscripts preserved to us sovereignly preserved?
Absolutely.
They're not accidentally preserved.
No.
But Harry Sturz would say that, that's absolutely true. But you know what else? God sovereignly preserved Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Codex Bezae, Claromontanus, the Coptic, the Sahidic, the Bahiric, the Acmimic, the Fayumic, the Itala. You know what I'm saying? We have a treasure trove of witnesses, and we should take all of them into consideration, not automatically reject any one of them.